Is there a housing crisis in the UK? So in this video, I just want to look at some of the data and share my opinion. Now, I will just say up front that I think my concluding opinion might ruffle a few feathers. It's maybe slightly controversial, but do just hit me out first because it's not a black and white issue. So if you look at the chart of historical house prices that we've got here on the screen, this is monthly data taken from the UK House Price Index, which can be found on the government website. Then all you see is a steady march up in the house prices in the long term, with some above and below trend movements, some boom periods, some bust periods. But I think the fact that house prices seem to have continuously gone up has led to people to have a simplified conclusion about housing, that housing will always continue to go up, that there aren't enough houses, that demand is outstripping supply. I think these are all quite common views held by people. But I do want to show some data I think tells a slightly different story, and I'm going to focus in particular on the last 20 years because that's when things seem to have changed quite a lot. So just before we get too far into the data, I do want to acknowledge that this isn't a conversation about housing affordability. This is a conversation about house prices only and the supply on the market, which is just a slightly different conversation. So I just want to recognise that nuance. So if we did just want to quickly comment on the affordability, you could make quite a strong argument, I think, that we're at the least affordable rates for over 100 years when you measure by earnings to price, as you can see from the chart on the screen. You could also look at the percentage of take-home pay that's spent on mortgages. And at 5.5% interest rate, your average first-time buyer is spending about 45% of their take-home pay on mortgage repayments. And that's at levels that we haven't seen since the late 1980s and then just again before the financial crisis in 2007. So what is the current government policy stance and what does the data say about that? So I will just say as well, there are some patches in the data that I've got presented here. I've tried to present the most relevant data I can, but obviously the further back we go, the more patchy it becomes. I'll also say that with the different devolved governments, there is a different quality of data that you get from different governments. So, for example, most of the data that I'm looking at here is from the turn of the millennium onwards, so 2001 up to around 2022, because that's when most of the up-to-date data sets arrive. Within those data sets, England generally has data all the way through, but it's a bit more patchy for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So I'll share some of their data a little bit later on, but for now I'm just going to look at England's data to start with. I think that's an okay proxy to use because England makes up about 85% of the UK's population, so it generally tells the overall story for the UK as a whole. So we can see that the population has been on a steady march up, so that's our blue line here on this chart. We see that the number of dwellings has also been rising, again pretty steadily, but again when we look at the data in a bit more detail, you'll see that it's a bit more up and down, the actual new dwellings being added per year, but the line looks pretty straight on this chart just because of the scale. But the yellow line is what I'm more interested in. So the yellow line is a ratio of the number of people per dwelling in the UK, and we'll see that other than a blip after the financial crisis, when house building pretty much dried up due to a lack of liquidity in the markets, we'll see that it's been on a downtrend for the last 20 years. So this to me is the first kind of clue that suggests we're adding a good number of new dwellings to the market. So if we zoom in on that net new dwelling data, I've split out the data here depending on the independent countries. You'll note that Wales doesn't quite go all the way back to 2001, and Northern Ireland doesn't start until around 2008's data. But we've got Scotland and England data all the way back to 2001. So you'll see that really England dominates the picture here just because of the percentage of the population that dwells in England compared to the rest of the UK. And we'll see that actually in England, UK net new dwellings being added is significantly back above the levels that it was pre-global financial crisis. Again, that dip that we saw in the data on the previous chart just after the financial crisis is borne out in this data. And you can see a massive drop off in the number of new dwellings added after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And it took a few years to recover, but broadly over the last sort of 6 or 7 years, it's been pretty stable actually in England now, the number of new net dwellings added. And we could say that for the same as the UK as a whole. It's been broadly stable now for quite a few years. But if we strip out England from the data, so I've just plotted here Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, we'll see that it tells a slightly different story. So only Scotland has made it back to its 2008 net new dwelling levels, and it's only just made that back, whereas say England, for example, is now adding more net new dwellings than it was in 2008. We can see that both Wales and Northern Ireland are at nowhere near the levels they were at in the early 2000s for new dwellings being added. And I think that data kind of gets masked when you just look at the overall picture just because of how dominant England is in that data. So also just before we look at how many net new dwellings we might need to add going into the future, I just want to show you house price data when adjusted for inflation. Now, I will just say I've cherry-picked this data. This is 2002 to 2022, It's inflation adjusted, again, taken from government data sources. And we can see that over that time period, house prices have been generally flat. Potentially, you could even argue with a slight trend down because of some of the spikes we saw in the early 2000s in house prices. And this flat period generally coincides with this period of elevated net new dwellings being added that we've seen over the last sort of 20 years. So if you aren't familiar with the kind of UK housing landscape, we had a lot of council-funded house building after the Second World War, and that started to drop off sort of 50s, 60s, 70s time period, and it took a little while to rebound, and it only really started to rebound coming into the 2000s when private developers really started to build a lot more new dwellings. And this period of flatlining growth also coincides with a period of the number of net new dwellings per head of population decreasing. So if you remember back to that chart we looked at earlier, which had the population, the new dwellings, and the ratio of the population to new dwellings, and that ratio was falling. And that roughly coincides with this stagnation of house prices in real terms. So I think the best way that we've got to judge how many new houses we might need to add going forwards is to look at future population data. So this data is all taken from the ONS, projecting forward to about 2045. Now, I have seen actually some non-official projections that go further than this. Some of those are actually predicting that the UK will reach a population peak around 2050, but the ONS data doesn't go that far, and it would have to drop off fairly severely from 2045 to reach that point. So I don't really know whether the official data would agree with that, but I've stuck with the ONS data here. And so we can see from the blue line here on the chart that the new population growth per year is expected to start dropping off, especially from the 2030s onwards. We're expected to only be adding around 300,000 new people to the population of the UK at around that time. And that's broadly shown with that slow flattening out of the red line that you can see on the chart, where we're currently adding more than 500,000 people to the UK's population per year. We're expecting to see that almost halve. So what if we want to keep the current ratio that we have of dwellings per head of population constant? Well, why would we use that as a kind of base marker? Well, if there really is that simple link between population and house prices, then if it's currently kept at the same levels, we'd see house prices just trend with inflation theoretically. So we know from previous data that in 2022, that level of population to dwelling ratio was at 2.27. So I've plotted here a couple of things on this chart. So first, in red is the government target. So the government target's around 300,000 net new dwellings per year. I've then also plotted in yellow the 2022 data, which was around 270,000 net new dwellings in the UK. And then in blue, you'll see how many net new dwellings we would actually need to add to keep track with that current ratio. And so you'll see that if we can maintain the current levels that we're building at, which is that 2022 yellow line, then we'll be adding a significant number of extra dwellings than we theoretically need, which could see further downward pressure on that ratio of dwellings per head of population. So where does that leave us? Well, I'm inclined to think that the UK might have found a rough equilibrium in terms of bringing new dwellings to the market now. And if anything, we're potentially expanding the housing supply faster than population growth over the next few decades. Now, obviously, trying to predict the future is a bit of a fool's errand, especially so far out into the future. And I'm relying on a lot of data which has different amounts of error in its capture and its projections going forward. But I think that it broadly explains the last sort of 20 years that we've seen of house prices, where they've been pretty stagnant in real terms. So this chart that I've got here on the screen, the only real outlier period I've kind of highlighted in a kind of red shade is in the 90s into the early 2000s, when we saw this massive house price boom way above the inflation trend. And really, since then, it's been pretty stagnant. So if we were to strip that period out, then we'd see that house prices haven't really actually outstripped inflation by that much in the last sort of 50 years. So the fact that we are adding a good number of net new dwellings potentially also relies on the UK returning to some form of good wage growth, which again, we haven't really seen over the last sort of decade or so. Then that could potentially, from an affordability point of view, bring houses back into line. And from a house price point of view, maybe track them more in line with inflation than the kind of above inflation rate that we've seen over the last 50 years. So really that's left me quite positive about the UK's housing situation. To me, this tends to suggest that maybe the worst is actually behind us. I'd love to hear some of your feedback as well. Do you agree? Do you disagree? This is obviously quite highly speculative, projecting out into the future like this. But I'd love to hear some of your anecdotal thoughts and if you've got any good data as well that you can share. But if this is the kind of conversation, the kind of data-driven approach that you like to see, then you probably like my newsletter, which drops into an inbox once a week. I'll look at a couple of different topics in the market, sometimes going more into the deep dive numbers, sometimes more of just a story and a news update. And you can also keep up to date with my £1 million investment portfolio journey, where I share a lot more data on the newsletter. If joining the newsletter doesn't appeal to you, then here's a video that YouTube thinks that you'll probably like to watch next. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the like button to spread this video to more people. Thanks very much for watching.